High Keeper Merrin cut the braided cord with a single measured motion, and the sound of snapped fibers filled the doorway. Initiate Aram let his hands fall and his mouth made a small raw sound. A cloistered acolyte turned his face away. Suspicion tightened the archivist's chest as he leaned on a stone pillar in the doorway, watching the cord fall apart in Merrin's gloved hand. The archivist counted the threads that separated and understood at once that this was not only ceremony but severing. The central problem stood clear in the doorway. The cult forbade initiates to know their own origins, and Merrin enforced that prohibition by destroying every physical tether to family and name. The archivist moved from his shadow toward the antechamber after the rite, but he kept his hands inside the sleeves of his robes and let the other acolytes pass first. He carried his grimoire under his arm, and a satchel of clipped manuscripts hugged to his side. His fingers kept brushing the brass reading glasses on their chain. He had been present for 3 initiations this season, and each time the same silence followed the cut. No questions, no names spoken, only a sealed acceptance. Suspicion pushed him to search the archives later that night. He needed to know whether this enforced anonymity was customary, accidental, or engineered. Aram, High Keeper Merrin, the syllable a slow stone thrown across the room. You stand bound to the order. You will not recall your household. You will not ask. Aram answered with 2 words. I understand. The archivist heard the words and heard the stiffness in Aram's shoulders. He noticed the blank wooden name Talon swinging at Aram's throat and the cord bracelet cut at both ends. He catalogued those details the way he catalogued entries in ledgers, evidence. The first external event arrived within minutes. Merrin ordered the acolytes to remove all personal tokens from the threshold. Hands moved quickly. A bowl of braided hair, a folded strip of cloth with a woven crest, a small iron ring were collected and carried away. The door closed on the pile of tokens and the archivist watched the pile shrink from sight. Later in the antechamber, Merrin recited the law that justified the cut. He spoke with the cadence of scripture and the room did not interrupt. Lineage is blood and burden Merrin. Lineage invites claim. We extinguish claim. Aram's jaw worked. But why not know where I came from? Knowledge breeds allegiance outside the order, Merrin answered. Allegiance fractures. The sanctum requires single loyalty. Aram bowed and the question remained lodged between his collarbone and his throat. The archivist recorded the exchange in his notebook with neat lines of ink and tiny margin ticks where he intended to follow up. The dialogue showed motive. Aram's hesitation showed pressure. The archivist felt the second emotional shift. Curiosity sliding into alarm. He could not accept a doctrine at face value. He had worked the archive for 22 years and he trusted paper more than dogma. That night the archivist went down to the archive chamber beneath the sanctum. He carried only a lamp and the satchel of clipped manuscripts. He moved across stone shelves and past sealed jars of pigment and a rotted shelf of vellum. He found a torn ancestral tablet half buried in ash, the kind of discovery he could not ignore. Someone had burned most of a tablet and left a torn fragment in the ashes of the furnace room. The fragment still bore carved names and an odd margin of deliberate excisions where some letters had been chiseled away. The archivist pressed the fragment to his palm and felt the grit of ash under his thumb. He sat at the long oak table and compared the tablet to the registry. The registry contained lists, but this fragment contradicted the registry. Names scratched out, lineages interrupted by thin gouges, a code mark in the corner that did not match ordinary clerical marks. The archivist traced the gouges with his fingernail and felt the edges, as if the cut had been made with a hand that wanted to hide rather than record. He recorded the discrepancy and slipped a scrap of cloth into his satchel to wrap the piece. That was discovery and evidence. The archivist did not return to his chamber. Instead, late under the slatted moonlight that filtered through the small windows of the archive, he arranged his notes and waited. He expected the ritual rhythm of the order, liturgy, meal, sleep, but instead a soft noise announced someone at the doorway. Aram. Aram moved with the stiffness of someone who had just had his name removed. He kept his head down. Archivist, he said. I need to know. Aram the archivist answered, closing the grimoire flat. You came here after the rite. I did. Aram's fingers fumbled at the blank talon. Tell me what was written on that tablet. The archivist studied Aram's face. The initiate's eyes were hazel and they searched the archivist's. You the question, the archivist, that makes you dangerous. Aram's lips parted. Dangerous to whom? The archivist leaned forward and removed the wrapped fragment from his satchel. He placed it on the table between them and lifted the lamp so the light grazed the carved lines. Read. Aram reached and ran a finger along the carved letters. They cut the names, he said. Would they cut names, the archivist, because some lines are marked for erasure? Aram. Not every initiate receives the same treatment. Aram swallowed. Marked by whom? By those who decide the order's continuity. The archivist's voice dropped. He named no one, but his hands trembled slightly as he refolded a margin note. They argued quietly for minutes that felt like hours. The archivist direct questions. Who signed off on the excisions? Aram answered, the Blade Priest. Which Blade Priest? Aram hesitated. The question pushed the second emotional change. Alarm slid into dread. Merrin. The archivist did not speak for a long measure. He counted breaths. He had suspected centralized control. He had not expected the custodian of secrecy himself to be the hands that chose which names to remove. The discovery forced him to shift strategy. He could conceal the fragment, raise a formal query, or confront Merrin. Each choice carried risk and promised a different outcome for Aram, for the archive, and for himself. Before they could settle, an impact sounded in the corridor outside. Heavy sandals, the rattle of the High Keeper's chain. Merrin entered without knocking, his golden collar scraping the stone. He looked at the table, then at the two men beside it, and his expression closed. He counted the papers and the lamp. His eyes fell on the fragment. You handled restricted material, Merrin. His cadence was slow and deliberate. The archivist met Merrin's gaze. I handle all material, Keeper. You handled this, Merrin, and his hand rested on the sealed locket at his collar, as if to remind them of the office it represented. You should not have shown it to a novice. Aram stepped back. Keeper, Merrin interrupted. Aram, silence. The confrontation quickened. 3 short lines that split the air. You had no right to ask Aram. You cut my cord. Cut the cord for the order, Merrin replied. You belong to us. You belong to yourself, Aram. Merrin's jaw tightened. The archivist watched their faces for the motion that would reveal intent. He recorded Merrin's gestures. The finger tapping the collar, the slight tilt of the head as if weighing scripture. He recorded Aram's hands, which trembled and then clamped into fists. The rapid exchange, 3 to 6 lines, served as confrontation and revealed what each intended. Merrin left the archive with a single order. All fragments related to recent initiations were to be sealed, and the furnace fires stoked to reduce the scraps to ash. The archivist felt a new pressure. The order sought to eliminate evidence quickly. He had to act. He slipped the wrapped fragment into an inner pocket of his robe and returned a false note to the registry shelf. The first external shift in days. Deliberate removal of records. In the days that followed, Merrin increased patrols of belief and ritual. He scheduled re-initiation drills and public recitations of the law. He tightened the chain of custody for documents, and he walked through the corridors like a man measuring loyalty by how people avoided meeting his eyes. The archivist observed and updated his ledger. He watched who bowed lower, who kept tokens under garments, who lingered at the registry reading names aloud, then quickly closing the book. Each observation registered like a notch on a tally. Aram sought the archivist twice more in the week after the cut. The archivist met him in the shadowed stacks. Their meetings contained more questions and a small plan. Aram would be given a false departure schedule, and the archivist would bring out a second fragment for him to study when the furnace was tended. The archivist instructed Aram to memorize a single line from the carved alphabet and to hide the knowledge in the hollow of his palm. The archivist felt a new emotion. Responsibility. Responsibility changed the calculus. It forced him to weigh betrayal of Merrin against preservation of human traces. They executed the plan the night of the third watch. The archivist removed a sealed register from the shelf under the pretense of cataloging it for the High Keeper. He walked into the furnace room, placed the register among the embers, then shifted the embers so that the register would not burn fully but would appear consumed. He stole a moment, slid the second fragment free from a false binding, and tucked it into Aram's tunic when the initiate passed him in the dim corridor. Aram's hand closed around the fragment and his eyes met the archivist. Remember the line, the archivist. Aram nodded. Aram remembers. They had a small victory that felt fragile. The mini cliffhanger arrived when, as they separated, a third step sounded behind them. Merrin's blade, priest. An attendant who did not belong to the High Keeper's inner circle, but who had been watching changes in the archive's foot traffic. He paused and scanned their faces. The archivist held still. Aram stepped into the shadow as if to disappear. The attendant moved on without comment, but the presence of an extra witness signaled danger. 2 nights later, the High Keeper convened a closed council at dawn. He brought forth a sealed scroll and set it on the ceremonial altar. The inner sanctum's light slivered through slit windows and fell on the scroll as if to illuminate its authority. Merrin spoke. This scroll contains the Order's account. It will replace private recollection. Aram stood at the edge of the altar and the ritual pressure pressed behind his ribs. Merrin opened the scroll with slow fingers and revealed blocks of inked lines that declared the official origin stories of certain initiates and assigned them to lineages chosen by the Order. Each assignment corresponded to a mark the archivist had seen on the torn fragment, the same code mark in the corner. You may accept the Order's version, Merrin. Or you may ask for your name to be returned to private custody and lose your place here. Aram's mouth went dry. Return my name, he said. You cannot, Merrin. The right cannot be undone. Then what is the use of this scroll? The archivist allowed. Merrin's gaze hardened. To unify history. To excise claim. Merrin presented Aram with a choice that functioned like a scalpel. Take the scroll and remain anonymous to family but secure within the Order. Or refuse the scroll and attempt to reclaim a name that the Order would treat as a private liability. The ultimatum split the chamber's air and became the chapter's climax. The archivist measured the decision in the twitch of Aram's hand and the way the initiate's jaw clenched. Aram reached for the scroll with a hand that shook. He paused, and in that pause the archivist noticed something the High Keeper did not intend to reveal. A stamped seal within the scroll's fold, a symbol that matched the pattern shaved along Merrin's temples. The archivist understood the implication. Merrin's office did not merely enforce anonymity. It authored the official versions of origin and stamped them with his authority. Aram closed his eyes and chose. He accepted the scroll and stepped forward. He laid his empty talon down on the altar and handed the fragment still hidden in his sleeve to the archivist with a brief, loaded look. The archivist felt the next emotion shift, dread folding into a determined quiet. He palmed the fragment and let the altar glaze of morning light strike his fingers so that no one would see. After the choice, Merrin commanded the destruction of ancestral tokens that had not yet been carried away. A small procession took those objects to the furnace. The archivist watched the tokens as they passed. A child's woven crest, a rusted signet ring, a length of cloth with an embroidered motif. He catalogued the way each item left the world. Some items fell and caught ember. Some were tossed into flame and curled. Some were smashed with a pestle. He recorded these as evidence of erasure and of ritual theater. At the back of the sanctum, when the procession distracted the attendants, Aram slipped the fragment into his tunic and then under his sleeve into the hollow of his palm. He met the archivist's eyes and mouthed, "Keep it." The archivist slipped the fragment into his own satchel later that day and placed another scrap, a blank piece of vellum, on the archive shelf to mask the absence. He felt the weight of that small rebellion in his satchel. He also felt the weight of risk increase. If discovered, both he and Aram would be stripped of place and possibly exiled. He noted the change in Merrin's posture when he noticed that a fragment was missing. The High Keeper frowned at the registry but did not accuse anyone aloud. That frown itself became evidence of suspicion. In the days after the altar, a surprising reveal altered what the archivist believed he knew. While cross-referencing registry entries with tax rolls, he found a ledger entry in Merrin's sealed chain of office account that named a house in the city, an address tied to an elder who decades earlier had questioned the Order's expansion. The ledger marked that house with the same code that had appeared on the torn fragment. The twist changed the meaning of the excisions. They were not neutral archival corrections. The archivist realized Merrin had singled out not only lineages that threatened cohesion but also families that had once opposed Merrin's consolidation of power. The erasure served political consolidation, not only ritual purification. He confronted Merrin with the ledger entry in private. "You marked them yourself?" The archivist, sliding the page across the table. Merrin's face tightened. You should not have pried into the chain ledger. Why mark them, the archivist? Merrin's voice became the measured recitation of ritual, collation, order, stability. You hide motives behind liturgy, the archivist. Merrin's reaction was a single small movement. He adjusted his collar and named no more. The confrontation revealed a second twist. The High Keeper's practice of erasure was an instrument of consolidation. The archivist understood that the archive itself had been weaponized, that knowledge forced a choice. The archivist considered public accusation, secret resistance, or gradual collection of evidence. He decided on covert preservation. He created false bindings, duplicated fragments, and hid a genuine index of names in the back of a ledger that he alone could access. He taught Aram how to ink a single glyph into the hem of his tunic so that the initiate could carry a mnemonic without speaking it aloud. Days passed in a pattern of ritual, cataloging, and secret returns to the archive. Each time the archivist returned, he found new evidence of systematic excision. Ledger marks that matched temple tax allocations, notes that referenced lineage cleansing in shorthand, and a record box stamped with Merrin's sigil containing orders signed in an older hand. The archivist copied what he could. Each copied page increased the stakes and tightened his throat with a pressure that manifested in a dry mouth and sleepless hours. A confrontation outside the archive forced action. An acolyte named Raylan, young, impatient, spoke loudly in the refectory about families who had lost sons to the order and asked why the names had vanished from public rolls. Where did they go? Raylan demanded. Merrin answered with a public ceremony and a closed explanation. He offered no evidence. Raylan pressed him, and their exchange became sharp. Merrin, you cannot hide names forever, Raylan. Merrin's reply was cold. Raylan, silence your tongue or remove your token. Raylan backed down, but the archivist watched the exchange and recorded it. The public confrontation forced Merrin to double down on secrecy. That push created an opening. The archivist used the noise to move a set of duplicated fragments out of the archive to a confidant in the outer city who owed him a favor. He arranged a transfer by leaving a ledger intentionally misfiled at the public desk, a small bait that a delivery clerk took and carried away. Aram left the order weeks later under the guise of being assigned to a distant outpost. He carried the empty talon and the one glyph soon inside his tunic. The archivist saw him to the gate and placed a small, wrapped fragment into Aram's palm without ceremony. Hide it well, the archivist. Aram nodded. Aram will not speak it. When the gate closed behind Aram, the archivist returned to the archive and replaced a confidential note on the shelf. He removed his gloves and his fingers smelled of beeswax and old ink. He replaced the wrapped fragment slot with a blank form and then went to the name's alcove. There he set an empty plaque in the space where a lineage once sat. He ran his thumb along the polished wood and felt the groove that would hold a name. He left it bare. He wrote a ledger entry that recorded what he had done and then hid the ledger in the false bottom of a drawer. The final scene closed with that concrete action. The archivist slid the confidential notes back into their place and left the empty plaque on the shelf. He had preserved a hidden seed of lineage in two small fragments, one entrusted to Aram and one locked in his satchel. He had not stopped the order, but he had kept a trace. The chapter ended with a measurable event, not a vague reflection. The archivist locked the archive door, set the lamp low, and felt the weight of the ledger against his ribs as he walked away. The archivist forced a ledger from the scribe's hands and exposed fresh gouges where names had been scraped away. Suspicion tightened his jaw. The scraper's metal rasp still sang in the chamber. Who ordered this? He said, voice low, and the acolyte blinked as if the question could strike a wound. The room smelled of boiled glue and damp vellum. A single candle guttered on the table. He did not wait for an answer. He turned the book so the gouges faced the low light, fingers mapping the pattern of removals. The first 5 entries were whole, then a ragged column of blankness began, then names interrupted by semi-circular cuts. The archivist touched the edge where ink had been scrubbed away and found a powdery residue of ash and scraped pigment. He had felt suspicion before, the small H that pushed him to check locked chests. Now that suspicion had sharpened into a concrete problem. Someone was removing identity from the ledger on purpose. That deliberate removal made the stakes immediate. He looked up name, he said to the scribe, who erased them. The scribe pressed both palms flat on the table and refused the look. "I was told to scrape, archivist." "I scrape and seal the page. No questions. Who you?" The archivist set the ledger down and spoke as he always did when he wanted a straight answer. Measured without dramatics, the scribe swallowed and named a title, not a person. The archivist needed a person. He moved closer until the faint scar over his left eyebrow brushed the scribe's line of sight. "High Keeper Merrin," the scribe said, "orders from the chain." The archivist's hands tightened on the ledger. The name landed like a struck bell. It matched gossip whispered after the braided cord had been cut in the doorway the previous night. He had watched Merrin cut the cord with a measured motion. He had seen Aram's hands fall, raw and empty. Now the ledger confirmed a pattern beyond a single initiation. Systematic erasure directed from the top. He left the archive in a single stride and moved toward the initiate's dormitory. He did not alert a guard. He wanted the silence of the corridors, the small human sounds that betrayed worry. A broom's scrape, a linen shift, a cough. He found Initiate Aram sitting on a low pallet, the blank wooden talon at his throat visible beneath the tunic. Aram's hands were folded in his lap. The archivist's chest contained a suspicion that required action. He spoke to test it. "Aram," he said, "has anyone touched your talon?" Aram's gaze lifted in a small, automatic motion. "It felt loose this morning," he said. "I thought it was the cord." The archivist reached out, careful, and slid the talon between his fingers. The wood had a new roughness along one edge, a torn notch where a name plate might once have been affixed. He ran a fingertip along the grain and found a thin tear of cloth wedged in a crevice. He did not name the thought that rose. Targeted, not random. Outside the dormitory under torchlight, a junior acolyte brought a crate from communal storage. "Archivist," she said, breathless. "Someone took a corner from the ancestral tablets. It was there and now it's gone." The archivist set the talon on the table and followed the acolyte to the storage chest. He opened it and saw the shallow depression where a tablet had sat. The crude, hollowed space smelled faintly of ash. He reached in and drew out a strip of burned clay, the edge bearing a single partial glyph that matched the worn cord on Aram's talon. Aram watched the strip with a look that mixed hunger and shame. "They removed names last night." The archivist, Merrin, ordered it. Aram's hands went to his throat. He a question without lifting his eyes. "Why my name?" The archivist did not answer in theory. He did what he could. He placed the torn edge of the clay strip in Aram's open palm. "Keep this," he said. "I will look further." They did not have the luxury of open investigation. The temple's day moved as ritual. Offerings at dawn, study after, purification before the hour of judgment. Word reached the ceremonial hall that the High Keeper demanded an audience. Merrin's chain of office clicked as he entered. The bone tokens swung like quiet accusations. The archivist and Aram stepped into the light of the hall. The keeper's robes fell heavy with embroidered sigils that glinted burnished gold. He raised his voice into the vaulted room. "Erasure is sanctification. Merrin, erasure frees service. Those bound by blood ask for release. We offer unmaking so the order remains whole." His speech moved through doctrine, but the archivist watched the mechanics. How he adjusted the collar before each line, how he paused to let the words land. When it came to questions, Merrin turned his head and inspected faces rather than eyes. The archivist noted that detail and filed it as evidence. He spoke after a breath. "High Keeper Merrin," the archivist, "the ledger shows recent removals. The ledger is a record, whose authority rewrites names." Merrin's amber eyes narrowed. "The order is older than ledger lines." "Archivist, I have the chain of office. That chain commands what words may remain, and the torn tablet, the talon that was rifled." The archivist held up Aram's talon for the room to see. A low stir moved through the acolytes. Aram's throat made a small, raw sound. Merrin's hand rested on the ceremonial blade at his hip, not an idle gesture. "Aram," Merrin, voice even, "you were bound to the cult. We untethered you from birth ties that would claim you. You serve here alone." Aram looked at the keeper. "Why my family?" he asked. "Who chose them?" Merrin's reply came slow and practiced. "The order examines the ledger and removes links that bind service to blood. The choice is not personal. It is administrative." The archivist watched Aram's shoulders sink and then tighten. He watched the initiate's fingers find the torn clay strip and hold it like a map. He felt a change within the room, from suspicion to doubt to a rising, hot anger that lived in hands, and in the sudden way voices sharpened. After the public justification, the archivist made a choice he knew would risk reprimand. He Merrin for limited access to restricted records, framing it as a routine audit. Merrin considered him, thumb-idly stroking the chain. You may read what is necessary, Merrin, but do not disturb sealed channels. The archivist accepted the permission as a narrow opening and treated it as a door he had to wedge further. That night, under a sky the temple's windows kept out, he and Aram moved through corridors that smelled of linseed and wax. The archivist wore his robes low and kept his brass glasses on a chain. Aram moved with a soft, watchful gait, keeping his head down to hide the scar of his cropped hair. They reached a sealed ritual vault behind a false shelf of unused registers. The archivist tapped a pattern he had learned from listening to clerks. 3 soft knocks, pause, 2 more. The lock yielded with a slow click. Inside, rows of name plaques sat like lined teeth on wooden shelves. Tablets leaned in labeled ranks. A low fire burned in a brazier used for ritual purification. The brazier's smoke had a chemical tang. Someone had left the ventilation slightly open. A thin dust, ashen-powdered pigment, lay between plaques. The archivist crouched and ran a finger along the carved surface of a plaque. Many names were intact. Many had been scraped. The central shelf carried newly scraped wood and a stack of torn tablets beside smoldering embers. Aram's breath came fast. He reached and picked up a tablet half consumed by flame. He pressed the clay to his mouth without realizing it, as if touch could restore what had been excised. Then he recognized a glyph and stilled. My grandfather's mark, he said, voice small. This is my line. The archivist's fingers tightened on a plaque. He saw evidence that the erasures were not evenly applied. Certain families had been targeted. He felt the emotion shift again. From measured investigation into a cold, precise anger that made his hands hold the ledger tighter. He moved along the shelves and found a ledger entry thumbed to a date 3 years prior, where a sealed decision had named specific family names for removal over time. Someone had altered the ledger to track which lines would be purged next. He slid a page free and read aloud, soft enough that only Aram heard, targeted removal of clan lines marked by token B 12 through 17. Implement in phase. Aram looked at him. Phase, he asked. They planned removal over years. The archivist, not random, not mercy. Strategy. A noise at the vault entrance made them both freeze. The scrape of a boot, the brazier's last ember flared. A guard's torchlight edged the doorway. The archivist shoved a handful of papers into his satchel and pushed a salvaged tablet into Aram's tunic. He moved to block the guard's view and smiled in a way he had used before to gain time. Merrin stood framed in the doorway, the guard at his side. His expression held the slow, deliberate control that never hinted at surprise. He stepped into the room and looked at the shelves with a scholar's eye. You two here? He asked. The words unfolded like a legal question. The archivist met Merrin's look. We were restoring damaged records, he said. Merrin's lips tightened. Then you found what you needed. You ordered removal. The archivist, the ledger shows intentional targeting, that the High Keeper's hands moved. He removed the chain of office and set it on the nearest shelf like a verdict. Archivist, he said. The order decides for the whole. We remove what will fracture service. You targeted families. The archivist, you selected names to vanish. Who authorized the selection? Merrin's gaze flicked to Aram, then back. The order authorized itself, he replied. It is not for servants to question what secures the cult, Aram answered then. The sound of him cutting through the ritual calm. Merrin, he said, my grandfather died a servant. He served carefully. He paid tithes. Why remove him? Merrin's face did not change. Aram, we sever ties to prevent loyalties that pull service. That is the law. Aram's mouth pressed together. My grandfather's name was carved on a tray in the kitchens. He was not a lord. Aram, Merrin voice steady. You understand service. The exchange turned quick, each line striking the other. The guard shifted. The archivist watched Merrin's hand touch the ceremonial blade's haft. He knew the next move would be formal and public. Merrin pronounced a punishment that would restore the order's control while demonstrating consequence. They were led out of the vault under guard. The punishment was public penance for Aram. The archivist received a quiet warning and a sealed reprimand that he was not allowed to speak of vault contents. Aram's penance included a public scourging of memory. His name would be omitted from the public rosters for 3 cycles. The humiliation was ritualized and strict. The archivist felt a new shift, the hope of discovery collapsing into the bitter reality of institutional force. Yet even in punishment the story did not end. That night, as torches guttered in the distant corridors, the archivist returned to his study. He set a small lamp on the desk and emptied his satchel onto the table. Beneath the legal pages he had hidden a fragment of clay the size of a fingernail. On it, a single wedge-shaped mark remained unburned. He polished the fragment with the cuff of his robe until the mark gleamed. The name on it was partial, but the stroke matched the carved plaque Aram had held. He took the scrap and wrapped it in a scrap of linen. He placed it in a pocket inside his robe where his brass glasses rested on a chain. He left the lamp burning low and moved toward Aram's cell. At the door he paused, listening to the low scrape of guards pacing. He slid the fabric through the narrow bars and let it drop at Aram's feet. The initiate bent and felt the linen's weight. He opened it and stared for a long moment at the preserved glyph. Keep it hidden, the archivist. Do not tell the others. Aram folded the piece into his palm and pressed it to his chest. What will you do? He asked. The archivist named no grand plan. He set a small, practical course. I will record what I can outside sanctioned registers. I will ask questions quietly. I will find the names that remain. Aram's jaw tightened and then relaxed in the shape of a decision. He rose and placed the clay fragment inside his tunic under the blank talon. He wiped ash from his cheek with the heel of his hand and then, without a speech, he wrapped his fingers around the talon. The motion was not a vow shouted aloud, it was tangible, a covert possession, a hidden map. The chapter closed on that small action. Guards turned their torches along the corridor and left. The archivist walked back to his study and recorded in a private page the ledger's tampering patterns and the dates marked. Phase, he copied the partial names, the glyph matches, and the notation that Meren had placed the chain on the shelf when he confronted them in the vault. He sealed that page in a hollow binding inside an old grimoire and set it on a shelf beneath his desk. He did not sleep. He sat and read the single line again. Targeted removal of clan lines. The words were concrete. They demanded choices. Mourning would bring ritual and public obedience. It would also bring a list of names that had been quietly altered. The archivist measured his options by action. Continue to gather proof, risk confrontation, or let the order proceed with its policy. He chose to keep the fragment. He chose to teach Aram how to trace a glyph by touch. He chose to ask for access again, to make small requests that would sound routine until they revealed pattern. He closed the lamp and felt the weight of the ledger beneath his hand. When he looked at the sealed grimoire, he had hidden the ledger. Page in, he pictured Meren's face when a private ledger proved the public doctrine false. The final sound before he left the study was the slow click of the corridor door, then the muffled folding of the temple shutters. The archivist tucked the salvaged fragment under his robe and passed into the hall. He did not speak of fate or horizons. He moved with a plan. Gather names, protect one initiate, and expose the mechanics of erasure to the smallest audience that could act. He had turned loss into a problem to solve. The archivist slid a single salvaged name, fragment, into Aram's palm. The fragment's edges crunched under his fingers as the corridor door clicked closed. They forced the sealed side, door at midnight, and pale stone scraped like fingernails across bone. Suspicion tightened the archivist's jaw before he could test the lock. His fingers found grit in the groove and his breath shortened into a steady cadence. The archivist pushed. The small door yielded a hairline and cold air spilled out. A niche of carved plaques lay behind the stone, a neat row of wooden name plaques blotted by ash. Aram's hand hovered over them with instinctive reverence. Aram, hold the light. The archivist. They moved with measured haste. The archivist slid a candle along the vault ledge and watched the flame pull at shadows. The candle's smoke smelled of beeswax and old pages. It made Aram cough. Aram steadied the wick with a clipped motion. The plaques a blank, Aram. His voice was low and steady, more habit than courage. He traced a thumb across a smooth face. The thumb returned dusty. Suspicion had driven them here. The archivist's suspicion narrowed into a plan. Find what the ledger hid. They lifted a scorched book from the shelf. Its cover was blackened at one corner, the leather stiff where fire had bitten. The archivist thumbed the edge. There were gouges where names had been scraped. He pressed his knuckle to a gouge and felt a residue of wax and iron. Someone scorched these on purpose. The archivist. He set the book on the stone table and flipped pages with deliberate short motions. Each turn released the same smell. Smoke, hot metal, salted ink. Footsteps hit the antechamber. A figure appeared in the doorway, the temple scribe, arched shoulders and inked hands trembling from the lamp. Behind him the silent acolyte blocked the corridor with an unmoving posture. The scribe's breath came quick. "What are you doing?" the scribe demanded. He reached for the ledger and the archivist retreated with a hand on the book's spine. "We have reason to search." The archivist. He kept his voice tight and low. This ledger was altered. The scribe's fingers flexed. Merrin ordered the removals, the scribe said, and the acolyte's eyes did not flicker. A quick shift of anger passed through Aram's face. He stepped between the scribe and the ledger and kept his palm flat on the page. "Then tell me why it was ordered." "Aram." The scribe's mouth tightened. "I cannot speak for Merrin here. I can only say the names were struck." He spoke as if repeating lines learned in a trial. The archivist measured the room. 2 narrow exits, the shelf of ash, the faint scrape marks at the ledger's edges. He slid a hand into his satchel and pulled a small iron scraper he'd kept since the last ledger they'd seen. He set it on the table like a counterweight. A second external event. The door behind them creaked and a wedge of corridor light slid in. The archivist examined the gouges. He pressed the scraper to them and found a layered seal below the surface. Pigment, resin, and a thin wash that had been scratched away. He whispered, "This is intentional. There are residues beneath the scraping." The scribe's shoulders loosened fractionally, then tightened again. "Who ordered this?" The archivist. The scribe stuck out a single name. High Keeper Merrin. Aram's fingers drew tighter on the blank talon at his throat. His nostrils flared. He moved like a man who wants to speak but weighs each word. A clatter from the vault's threshold made all of them look up. Ceremonial footsteps, slow and deliberate, reached them before Merrin appeared. A figure framed in the doorway, robes catching the candlelight, the golden collar at his throat reflecting a cold amber. He did not rush. He stood broad and patient, adjusting his collar with the measured motion the archivist had seen before. The room contracted around him. Merrin, the archivist. He did not step back. His voice lacked accusation but carried a thin edge. Merrin's amber eyes scanned faces and rested on Aram. The High Keeper's mouth made a small line. "You break trust to seek it." Merrin. His cadence was even. He removed his hood with a single motion and offered the preserved cord from his vestments, as if presenting a relic. Merrin set the cord on the table and opened the sealed locket that hung on his chain of office. Inside lay a small, folded scroll, its edges untouched by the ledger's scorch. He tapped the scroll with one finger. "We do not remove names without doctrine," he said. "We do not restore without cost." He did not raise his voice. His tone held ritual weight. The archivist felt the room tilt into a courtroom where the law was ceremony. Aram stared at the cord and the talon at his neck. Suspicion curdled into anger, and anger slid into a thin, hard resolve. "Show me the right." The archivist. His hand brushed the scraper and his fingers did not shake. Merrin nodded once and led them deeper into the vault toward an altar alcove. The altar's stone top bore the dark ring where many hands had rested. A single candle burned at one end and its light caught the filigree of a ceremonial blade. Merrin picked up the blade with both hands as if handling scripture. He explained the rite without theatrics. He unrolled the scroll and laid it flat. The script inside was cramped and precise, inked in a steady hand. Anonymity binds the initiate to the order. Ancestry binds them to kin. The cord severs the tie. The ledger records the change. When a name is struck, a seal hides the origin to prevent outside claims. His words were concrete, factual. He demonstrated a knot in the cord, looped and then cut with the blade. The blade's small metallic snap echoed off stone. Aram's jaw clenched. The archivist watched Merrin's hands. Merrin spoke like a man cataloguing whether, why erase rather than educate. The archivist. He held the scroll flat with 2 fingers. Because lineage breeds divided loyalty. Merrin, because the cult must be a single body. His voice lowered. Aram's fingers closed around his talon until the edges bit shallow crescents into his skin. A tremor passed through him that he kept inside his chest. The emotion shift arrived. Suspicion, determination, anger, a raw desire for recovery. He spoke without looking up. "Then restore me." His words were a small, taut thing. Merrin's lips did not move at first. He adjusted his collar and placed his palm flat on the scroll. Restoration requires exchange, he said. Either you take another's anonymity, and that life is severed, or both you and the petitioner accept permanent veiling. He inhaled and the candle flame shivered. You cannot reclaim an origin without erasing someone else. The archivist felt the ledger's weight like a new tangible law in the room. Aram's fingers left wet marks on the talon and his voice was a brittle line. I will not take another's name. The scribe's lips parted. The acolyte's face remained vacant. The archivist moved faster than he intended. He slid his hand beneath the ledger and found a thin play of hidden folio tucked behind the burned pages. He wrenched it free. The folio uncurled like a quiet map. A cipher ran across its inner margin. He read aloud, haltingly at first, the lines that named places and dates and families, names that had been catalogued elsewhere. They were catalogued, he said. These names exist in a hidden ledger. Restoration is possible but controlled. He looked up and saw Merrin's eyes narrow. Merrin reached for the folio and the archivist held it out of reach. Give it to me, Merrin. The archivist did not hand it over. Aram stepped forward and placed a hand on the archivist's wrist. Archivist, Aram. His voice was low. Do not let him take it. The scribe moved closer. His hands found the ledger's edge. The acolyte remained a wall. The room filled with constrained sound. Cloth rustle, iron scrape, and the slow click of Merrin's blade shifting in its scabbard. Words tightened into a negotiation. If these names exist, why hide them? The archivist demanded. He kept the folio pressed against his chest. Merrin's mouth made a flat sound because an origin used as leverage keeps loyalty clean. Merrin answered, because restoration creates debt. The order must not owe its members to outside kin. The archivist, you owe them truth. Merrin did not meet that claim. He set the blade on the altar and tapped it. Truth is also a weapon, he said. Aram's voice broke the ritual cadence. Then let me choose, he said. Let me restore only what I can accept. He pulled the talon out from under his tunic and placed it on the stone beside the blade. It lay there, plain wood with a notch at the bottom where a name tag would attach. I will not accept a life silenced for mine, Aram added. He kept his eyes on Merrin. A brief clash of motion followed. The scribe lunged for the folio, and the archivist dropped the ledger to block him. Pages fanned and a smear of ash fell across the altar. The acolyte moved like a lodged hinge and stepped between man and man. Stop, the acolyte said. His voice was small but carried. For a moment the room held its breath anchored to that single word. The archivist had a shard of clarity. The folio proved a different maintenance of names, but the ritual's rules remained intact. The tension peaked and then split into a shorter, sharper crisis. Who would pay to restore Aram? Merrin made a choice. He lifted the sealed scroll and read 3 names aloud. He pronounced them with the same rhythm as he would a blessing. The scroll contained a clause the archivist had not expected. An exchange could be arranged by consent among the initiates, but consent had to be final and registered. You cannot bargain with a ledger that has been burned, the archivist. He pointed to the scorched book and the ash rimmed the table. The scribe's expression crumpled. He had scraped names under orders, but he had never burned the ledger in full. The archivist found a sudden plan in his head that moved faster than fear. He would not allow the ledger to be lost outright. He looked at Aram and then at Merrin. If restoration is a choice, the archivist, then offer Aram a vote among the living initiates. If the initiates yield consent, restoration proceeds without forced exchange. Merrin's eyes flicked to the blade, and if they refuse, Merrin, then the ledger remains sealed and the order continues, Merrin answered. His voice sharpened. You know our law. You of all people know it. The archivist's hand tightened on the folio until a thin white line of pressure showed on his knuckle. Aram swallowed audibly. He stepped away from the altar. Archivist, he said. I will not ask my brothers to choose between me and them. I will not. His voice held a brittle refusal. The archivist understood that this was no longer only about his curiosity. This was about Aram's integrity. The archivist's suspicion softened into a different urgency. Protect Aram from becoming a bargaining chip. A sudden knock came at the outer vault door, another external event, sharp and authoritative. 2 cloaked acolytes entered, faces unreadable. They bore the insignia of the outer ward. One of them carried a tray with hot coals and a small iron brazier. He set it down and did not speak. Merrin's eyes tightened. He glanced at the coals as if evaluating ritual timing. "They burned records 5 years ago," the acolyte said, and his voice had a tinge of restrained sorrow. "A purge followed a failed insurrection. Names were removed to protect families from reprisal." The archivist heard the detail and felt the shape of motive sharpen into a concrete cause. Political preservation. The archivist held that new fact like a compass. He demanded specifics. "Who ordered the purge?" he asked. The outer acolyte shifted his stance and said, "Council edict, then Merrin's seal." "It was meant to stop blood feuds," the archivist pressed. "And who kept the hidden folio?" The acolyte's hand drifted to his throat. "Merrin's office kept a copy," he said. "It was not for initiates." The archivist's jaw tightened. He looked at Aram. "Do you wish to restore with a collective consent?" Aram closed his eyes briefly. "I want to hold my name in my own hand," he said. Merrin moved with the cool deliberation of a man making a verdict. "You may petition," he said. "The council will vote. If the council grants restoration, the ledger will be used to register identity and a public oath will be taken. If not, the record remains sealed or destroyed." He set the scroll back in the locket and closed it with a measured fold. "I will allow the petition," Merrin added. "But there will be conditions." The archivist looked at the outer acolyte and the scribe. Both of them had faces that now bore decision. The scribe said, "Archivist, if you publish the folio you endanger those families." That sentence carried a new threat, concrete and immediate. The archivist felt the ledger's authority press into his hands. He counted options quickly. Publish and risk blood. Use the folio to demand a council hearing. Or conspire to hide a fragment and hope for partial restoration. He felt old caution and a new stubbornness collide. "We will petition formally," he said at last. "I will present the folio. We will ask the council for a vote. Aram will present his case before the order." Merrin inclined his head. "Then we will proceed at dawn, Merrin." They moved toward the outer corridor. The archivist tucked a small cipher fragment into an inner pocket of his robe, beneath the leather-bound grimoire. He did it with a slow and careful hand. He did not announce the motion. Aram watched him and then adjusted the wooden talon at his throat so the blank face sat squarely. The archivist felt the immediate physicality of the talon against Aram's chest and understood how the object carried its own small language of loss and possibility. The council met before the temple's rising sun in a low rectangular room lined with benches. The archivist presented the folio without flourish. He put it on the stone table and let the council members touch the paper. Murmurs moved through the benches like a low current. Names were read and met with silent responses, rustle of cloth, and occasional sharp exhalations. The archivist watched faces for signs of alliance. The scribe testified about the scraping and the burn. The outer acolyte testified about the purge. Merrin spoke last and framed anonymity as discipline. His voice held the same steady ritual cadence. Arguments unfurled with concrete examples. The archivist leaned on the table and said, "These names are not merely lists. They are kin, trades, debts, and claims." Hiding them removed outside recourse and made the order the final arbiter. He did not say fate or destiny. He pointed to ledgers and bonds. Merrin replied, and outside recourse invited reprisals. The order spared families by severing ties. A councilman named Dallin argued that public restoration would revive blood feuds. A councilwoman named Sarah countered that secrets had created resentments within the order. The votes were close and the debate touched the ledger's practical consequences at every turn. Aram stood to address the council. His hands shook at first, then found steadiness. He put the talon on the table and spoke plainly. "I lost a name when the cord was cut. I lost neighbors who would have answered for me. I lost my mother's bread oven and her complaints. I lost a cousin's barrow. I ask only to know where they are." His list of specifics made silence fall. He did not ask to punish anyone. He did not ask to change the ritual. He for a record in his hand. The council voted. The archivist watched Merrin's face as the tally was called. The numbers were tight. When the final voice fell, the council granted a limited restoration. Aram could reclaim his origin if a volunteer among the initiates consented to permanent anonymity in his stead. The archivist felt the ground shift. The clause was a compromise that kept the ritual's core while offering a regulated path. Aram's eyes went to the circle of initiates sitting along the benches. He scanned faces as if trying to identify who might accept such a cost. An unexpected hand rose. Scribe Thomas, the man who had scraped the ledger's pages, stood and said, "I cannot restore names I struck. I cannot undo my hands. But I will volunteer for anonymity in exchange for Aram's restoration." The room reacted. Thomas's voice did not waver. He had ink along his knuckles and ash under his nails. "Thomas R. Aram." The name was both an address and an accusation. Thomas's response was a single contained line. "Aram, I will not let you carry my shame." He put his palm on the ledger and closed his eyes. An argument flickered at once. 3 rapid exchanges. "Thomas, you can't." The archivist began. "Archivist, he will not be cursed." Merrin, "Thomas, did you consent?" The councilwoman, "Sarah, I consent." "Thomas, I consent now." The exchange was quick and direct, concrete in motion and decision, and it shifted the chapter's moral axis. The archivist watched as Thomas stepped forward and offered a cord of his own, a thin thread he'd kept hidden beneath his sleeve. Merrin inspected the cord and then the ledger. "Then the law requires ritual registration and a permanent sealing," he declared. He prepared the blade, and Aram and Thomas stood across from each other at the altar. The ritual was clinical and swift. Thomas tied his cord and handed it to Merrin. He did not speak as the blade cut. The sound was small and final. A name plate was placed where Thomas's identity would have been and then rotated blank. The archivist watched the physical exchange. A wooden block turned, a seal pressed, a roll of wax warmed. Aram felt each motion as if it were a pulse. When it ended, Merrin opened the hidden folio and read the sequence that permitted a transfer. He spoke the registration aloud. The archivist recorded every word with a steady hand because he knew that words could be archived even when names could not. The ceremony concluded with a binding oath. Thomas slid his talon over Aram's hands, and Aram placed his recovered name plaque into the slot. The plaque bore a single line inscribed in careful script. "A family house in the market quarter, a mother's name a year." Aram lifted the plaque and pressed it to his chest. His hands shook. Violence had been possible. The climax had been a moral duel played out with ritual instruments rather than blades. The immediate demand, "restore or be erased," had resolved into a different cost. Voluntary sacrifice. The archivist felt relief and a residual unease. The ledger had not disappeared. It had been used and altered in a room of witnesses. At the final motion, the archivist slipped a cipher fragment into his inner pocket. A small, legal trace that told the ledger's fuller story in shorthand. He did not speak of it then. He watched Aram pin the plaque and feel the grain of wood press against his collarbone. In the outer courtyard, they burned the outward ledger. A brazier took the scorched book, and the flames leaped with a sound like dry parchment popping. The council called it closure. The archivist watched ash lift into the low sky and felt how a public burning made guilt visible. He had tucked the folio fragment away precisely because the public burn concealed more than it revealed. He had learned that secrecy lived in 2 places: the visible flame and the hidden pocket. Aram adjusted the wooden plaque at his throat and tested its weight. He looked at Thomas. Thomas would return to anonymous duty with a carved notch that no one would read. Thomas gave no speech. He returned to his post at the scriptorium with his shoulders set to a new line of labor. The archivist watched them both and knew the cost had been paid in measured pieces. Dawn reached the vault in thin lines. The archivist walked the corridor with the cipher fragment heavy against his ribs. He set the fragment beside the grimoire and then closed his hand over them both. He would not publish the folio. He would file the fragment in a place he trusted, and he would wait for a moment when truth could be used without blood. He had preserved a record in part and allowed a public closure in part. It was not justice in any absolute scale, but it was an arrangement that kept Aram's name and spared a wider rupture. The temple returned to its ordered routine. High Keeper Merrin resumed his rounds and adjusted his collar, as if the night had been one more ledger entry. Thomas worked with ink as he always had. Aram learned the cadence of saying his name aloud, short, careful, like pronouncing a measurement. The archivist kept to the stacks and the folios, his chest still tight sometimes with suspicion that would not wholly leave him, but also with a steadier sense that some secrets could be managed. The final concrete beat of the chapter occurred before the sun had fully climbed. The archivist handed Aram a small wooden box containing the cipher fragment sealed in wax for safekeeping. "Keep this until you can decide what to do with it." The archivist. Aram slid the box into his tunic and closed his fingers over it. He nodded once. The nod was quiet and firm. The ledger had been outwardly burned. A fragment remained in a pocket. A man had given his anonymity for another's name. The choices had been made in action, not in speeches. The chapter closed with the sound of a door shutting and the scrape of sandals on stone as the temple resumed its rituals. The archivist walked the outer corridor and felt the rasp of morning air. He breathed and tightened his hand on the grimoire chain. The ledger's final cost had been paid in a human exchange, and the cost of recall had been measured in daily acts. Thomas returning to the scriptorium, Aram saying his name when called, Merrin keeping his office sealed. The ledger's truth would exist in that small cipher and in the memory of those who had witnessed the vote. The immediate conflict had ended, and every character left the room with a role and a changed weight. At dawn the ledger burned in the yard, while the archivist slipped a cipher fragment into his robe and Aram adjusted the new talon at his throat. The scene resolved with concrete motions and choices. A public burning, a private retention, and a man who'd reclaimed one small portion of himself at another man's sacrifice. That compromise concluded the night's struggle and left the temple to its disciplined secrecy, altered but intact.